Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Tormenting the Taxmen. From the year 37 of the Common Reckoning, Haldan, the king of the dwarves of the Dark Hills, sent groups of his soldiers north from the Hillhold into the lands between South Vale and the Silver Stream to demand tax payments from the dwarves who dwelt there. One such dwarf, who farmed in those lands, was called Norby. When Haldan's spear dwarves arrived on his doorstep demanding tax, payable in coin or in valuables, Norby refused to pay. As a result, he was beaten, his wife was violated, and his farmstead was burned. Norby swore vengeance. He gathered around him a band of dwarves who had suffered similar treatment, and they waged an incessant war of ambush and attrition against Haldan's tax collectors. Norby and his companions were lightly armed, and so did not seek a fair fight. Rather, they would stalk a group of Haldan's men, loosing crossbow bolts at them from positions of concealment, reducing their numbers to the point where the survivors could be rushed and finished with knife work. Norby and his band would then melt back into the forest. In the year 39 of the Common Reckoning, Haldan's youngest brother, named Hord, led a group of dwarves on a tax-collecting mission. Having extracted movable wealth from a number of dwarvish farmers, he was leading his men back home when he was ambushed by Norby. Tax-raising parties were not usually large. Many small groups of dwarves could visit more potential taxpayers than a few larger groups. And it does not take many soldiers to threaten and terrorise a single farmer and his family. Altogether, Hord's group contained 6 dwarves. Along with Hord himself, armoured in mail and carrying an axe and shield, there were 3 like-armoured spear dwarves with shields, and 2 dwarves clad in gambeson and bearing crossbows. There was also a donkey, which was pulling a wagon, which was fully loaded with loot. Norby and his companions were less well equipped. Norby was wearing mail and carrying an axe, both of which he had previously liberated from a dead tax collector. He also carried a hunting horn. With him were 4 other dwarves, all unarmoured and all carrying crossbows. Norby had selected for his ambush an uninhabited stretch of wilderness, a monotonous landscape of low hills and scattered trees. As Hord and his companions entered a shallow valley, a hunting horn sounded. One of Norby's dwarves appeared on their right, and the crossbow bolt fizzed over the head of the leading spear dwarf. Hord ordered his crossbow dwarves to shoot back, while urging his band forward along the path. Another dwarf emerged, on Hord's left this time, stepping out from behind a tree. A crossbow bolt buried itself in one of Hord's crossbow dwarves, who fell lifeless to the ground. The wagon and the dwarves around it had now advanced to a point where they had interposed a mound between themselves and their first attacker. They were congratulating themselves on thus evading the missiles of one of their 2 tormentors, when a third of Norby's dwarves appeared, stepping out from behind another tree, and a crossbow bolt thudded into the right side of their wagon. But Hord's remaining crossbow dwarf levelled his crossbow, took careful aim, and put a bolt into this new attacker. Meanwhile, the first of Norby's dwarves had moved around the back of the mound and once more appeared on the scene, but his crossbow bolt went wide. The bolt that was loosed back at him by Hord's crossbow dwarf was more accurate, and another of Norby's dwarves was dispatched. Having dealt with the dwarves to their right, Horde and his band pressed forward, his crossbow dwarf now taking up the rear to exchange shots with the dwarf who was still sniping at them from the left side of the valley. But this time Norby's marksman proved more accurate, and it was Horde's crossbow dwarf who met his end. And now the last of Norby's crossbow dwarfs appeared on Horde's left, and Horde's leading spear dwarf died. Horde and the two spear dwarfs that were left to him took cover behind the wagon, urging the donkey onward. For a moment it looked as if they might get away, but Norby was not prepared to let that happen. He wanted the contents of that wagon, and while he would prefer to have a donkey to help move them, he could manage without. He called to the nearest of his dwarves to shoot the donkey dead. The dwarf did so, and the progress of the wagon was abruptly halted. And now Norby's two remaining crossbow dwarves emerged into the open, moving around the wagon, taking pot shots at Horde and his dwarves. This was too much for Horde. He had nothing to shoot back with. He could not order his spear dwarves to charge his assailants and impale them, as Norby's dwarves, being unarmoured, were fleeter of foot and would simply run away and then continue to loose bolts at him from a safe distance. So he and his companions turned and fled. Norby and his dwarves did not follow him. There was plenty of booty in the wagon, and they would have to carry it back to their camp. They had tormented the taxmen enough for one day.